Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. The obsidian maw hung in the void like a monument to really, really bad life choices. It was the kind of place where hope went to die, screaming. A massive orbital prison owned and operated by the Grath Empire, it housed the galaxy's worst criminals, terrorists, and the occasional idiot who'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Today's idiot? A human named Dan. Dan stood in the intake processing chamber, hands cuffed behind his back, looking about as concerned as someone waiting for a bus that was only slightly late. He was average height for a human, which meant he was considerably shorter than most of the guards surrounding him. Brown hair going a bit gray at the temples, weathered face with laugh lines that suggested he'd spent more time grinning at danger than running from it, and eyes that held the particular brand of exhaustion that comes from seeing too much universe for too long. "Forward, human," growled Warden Polnexra, all four of his massive arms crossed over his chest, in what Dan assumed was the Grath equivalent of looking intimidating. It was working. The warden was built like someone had taken a crocodile, a bodybuilder, and a nightmare, then mashed them together and given the result anger management issues. His scales were a deep emerald green that caught the harsh overhead lights, and his eyes, all six of them, tracked Dan's every movement with predatory focus. "You know," Dan said, shuffling forward in his ankle restraints, "I really think there's been a misunderstanding. I was just passing through. Totally innocent. Scout's honor." One of the guards, a younger Garath with lighter scales, hissed what might have been a laugh. "You were in restricted military space, human. 3 parsecs deep into the exclusion zone." "Was I?" Dan's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "See? My navigation computer's been acting up. I kept telling myself, Dan, you need to get that thing serviced, but you know how it is. You put it off, and then suddenly you're being arrested by giant space lizards, and you're thinking, I really should have dealt with that sooner." Polnexra's expression didn't change. It was hard to tell if he was amused, annoyed, or contemplating which piece of Dan to bite off first. Silence. Step into the scanner. The biological scanner was a ring of pulsing blue light, wide enough for even the largest species to stand inside comfortably. It was standard procedure, Dan knew. Every prisoner got scanned, catalogued, analyzed down to their genetic code. The system contained biological data on over 8,000 sentient species across the known galaxy. It could identify you, assess your threat level, catalog any biological weapons or enhancements, and recommend security protocols, all in under 30 seconds. Dan stepped into the ring, the restraints on his ankles making a dull clinking sound against the metal floor. The scanner hummed to life, blue light intensifying until it was almost white. Dan felt the familiar tingle of deep tissue scanning, like someone running their fingers through his molecules. He'd been through these before. Multiple times, actually. More than most people. Though he'd never mentioned that little detail. The hum became a whine. Then the whine became a sound that scanners probably weren't supposed to make. A sort of confused warbling that made several guards exchange glances. "Is it supposed to do that?" Dan asked helpfully. "Quiet!" Polnexra snapped, but Dan could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. The display screen flickered. Once, twice. Then text began scrolling across it, far faster than normal. Scanning. Genetic structure identified. Species classification. Searching database. Error. Recalibrating. Species, human, Homo sapiens. Planet of origin, Earth, Sector 339b, average threat. Level, 2.3 of 10. See? one of the guards said, relaxing slightly. Just a human. Threat level 2.3. Barely worth. The screen flickered again. Anomaly. Detected. Cellular analysis. Error. Regenerative capability. Undefined. Rescanning. Threat level. Error. Status. Unkillable. The room went very, very quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when reality does something it absolutely should not be doing, and everyone present is trying to decide if they saw what they think they saw. Polnexra stared at the screen, then at Dan, then back at the screen. Unkillable? He said slowly, like he was testing out a word from a language he didn't quite speak. Dan shrugged, which was impressive given the restraints. Your scanner might need a firmware update. I hear the new patch fixes a lot of bugs. Run it again, Polnexra ordered. The technician, a small insect-like creature with too many eyes and not enough confidence, tapped at the controls with trembling appendages. Running secondary scan, Warden. The blue light intensified again. Dan stood patiently, humming a tune under his breath that might have been an old Earth song about staying alive. The irony was not lost on him. This time the scanner cycled through its protocols faster, as if it was getting impatient with its own results. Species, human. Regenerative capability, beyond database parameters. Fatal injury, survivability. Yes. Biological immortality, probable. Status, unkillable. Recommended security, protocol, unknown. Well, Dan said into the silence that followed, that's a fun feature. Polnexra's facial expression was doing something complicated. It cycled through disbelief, suspicion, confusion, and finally settled on irritation with a side order of bureaucratic frustration. The scanner is malfunctioning. It must be. Humans are fragile, short-lived. They die from practically everything. He waved one of his massive hands dismissively. Toxins, pressure changes, temperature extremes, inadequate moisture, excessive moisture, the wrong kind of air, the wrong kind of food, the wrong kind of microbes. We're delicate flowers, Dan agreed. Very true. This is clearly a technical error, Polnexra continued, more to himself than anyone else. The scanners are maintained by the lowest bidder. The Empire cuts corners everywhere. Last month, the food processors identified a shipment of nutritional paste as a Class 5 biohazard. He turned to the technician. Note the equipment malfunction in the log. Assign this human to cell block 9 with the general population. Standard security protocols for a human male. The technician's eyes quivered with what might have been doubt. But, Warden, if the scanner is correct— It is not correct, Polnexra interrupted, his voice taking on the tone of someone who has made an executive decision and will not be accepting further input at this time. Humans do not have regenerative capabilities beyond minor wound healing. They certainly are not unkillable. If they were, their species would dominate the galaxy instead of occupying 12 minor colony worlds and one backwater planet they are overly sentimental about. 13 colony worlds, actually, Dan interjected. We just established a new one on— I do not care. Polnexra gestured to the guards. Take him to processing. Get him out of my sight. 2 guards grabbed Dan by the arms and hauled him out of the scanner ring. As they dragged him toward the door, Dan glanced back at the screen, still flashing its impossible readout. Status: unkillable. He allowed himself the smallest smile. This was going to be interesting. The processing continued with all the efficiency and warmth of a meat grinder. Dan was stripped of his personal belongings, which amounted to a worn jacket, a small data pad that didn't work anymore, and a photo of a young woman with kind eyes and his same stubborn chin. The processing officer, a bored-looking amphibian creature with skin the color of old moss, barely glanced at the items before tossing them into a storage container. "You get these back when you are released," the officer croaked. "And when will that be?" Dan asked. "You are charged with unauthorized entry into restricted space, possible espionage, and failure to respond to military hails. Minimum sentence is 80 cycles." 80 cycles. That's what, about 30 Earth years? 32.6. Great. I'll be sure to behave myself. The officer's throat sac inflated and deflated, which might have been a laugh. "You will not survive 32 years here, human. Most of your kind do not survive 30 days. "You know what?" Dan said, stepping into the prison uniform they'd thrown at him, a shapeless gray jumpsuit that smelled like despair and industrial cleaning solution. "I'm feeling optimistic." Cell Block 9 was exactly as welcoming as it sounded. It was a massive circular chamber with cells carved into the walls at multiple levels, connected by walkways and anti-gravity lifts. The center was an open faucet common area where prisoners gathered, fought, made deals, and generally engaged in the sort of activities that make prison wardens sigh heavily and reach for stress medication. As the guards escorted Dan across the main floor toward his assigned cell, every eye in the place turned to watch. And there were a lot of eyes. Species from across the galaxy, most of them big, many of them armed with natural weapons like claws or fangs or stingers, all of them with the same look of casual violence that comes from having nothing left to lose. A human in this place was unusual. Humans were rare this far from Earth-controlled space, and when they did show up in places like this, they typically didn't last long. "Fresh meat," someone growled in Galactic Common, the trade language most species used when they wanted to threaten someone from a different planet. "Looks soft," another voice added. "Looks dead already," came a third opinion, followed by what might have been laughter or possibly digestive distress. Hard to tell with some species. Dan kept his eyes forward, his expression neutral. He'd learned a long time ago that showing fear was a mistake, but so was showing too much confidence. The key was to look like someone who was present, aware, and fundamentally unbothered by the current circumstances. Like a man waiting for a train that was definitely coming, probably soon, and he had nowhere else to be anyway. His cell was on the 3rd level, a small rectangular space with a cot that had seen better decades, a waste disposal unit that had seen better centuries, and a small shelf bolted to the wall. No window, no privacy screen, just walls, floor, ceiling, and the faint smell of despair with undertones of ammonia. "Home, sweet home," Dan muttered, sitting down on the cot. It creaked ominously, but held his weight. The guards locked the energy barrier across the cell entrance, a shimmering field of force that would deliver a nasty shock to anyone who touched it without authorization. Then they left without another word, their heavy footsteps echoing down the walkway. Dan lay back on the cot, hands behind his head, and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in this facility, in the depths of the prison's database, were records. Records of ships that had passed through this sector. Records of military operations. Records that might, if he was very lucky and very careful, tell him where they'd taken the colony ship. Where they'd taken Gia. His daughter's face floated in his mind, frozen at age 19, the last time he'd seen her before she'd boarded that ship. Young, excited, ready to start a new life on a colony world so far from Earth that the light from their sun would take 100 years to reach home. The ship had vanished 8 months ago. No distress call, no debris field, just gone. But Dan had heard rumors, whispers in spaceport bars and black market data streams, Whispers about Grath military operations in that sector. About colony ships being intercepted. About labor camps on outer moons where prisoners worked until they died. And no one ever asked questions because the Grath Empire didn't like questions. So Dan had pointed his ship toward Grath space, disabled his transponder, and flown straight into their restricted zone, until they had no choice but to capture him. Getting arrested had been the easy part. Getting into their database would be harder. Getting out again. Well, that's where being unkillable might come in handy. Dan closed his eyes and let himself drift, not quite sleeping, but not quite awake, in that space where his mind could wander while his body rested. A skill he'd picked up over the years, over the very, very long years since the Genesis Point incident had turned him into something that wasn't entirely human anymore, something that couldn't die, even when he wanted to. The cafeteria of the Obsidian Maw was less of a dining facility and more of a gladiatorial arena where food happened to be present. Long metal tables bolted to the floor, harsh lighting that made everything look slightly diseased, the smell of 100 different species' nutritional requirements being met with the absolute minimum effort required by Galactic prison standards. Dan had been in the Obsidian Maw for 3 days now, and he'd spent most of that time keeping his head down, observing patterns, and eating food that tasted like someone had tried to make paste edible and given up halfway through. He'd also been planning. The prison's computer terminals were accessible from the library, a small room on level 5 that most prisoners ignored because literacy wasn't high on the priority list when you were serving a life sentence for murder. Dan had visited twice, poking around the public-facing systems, learning the security architecture, identifying weak points. But right now, sitting at a corner table with his tray of gray nutritional sludge, Dan was focused on a more immediate problem. Grelmoth was staring at him. Grelmoth was what happened when evolution decided that insects should be the size of bears and given personalities to match. 8 feet tall, covered in chitinous plates the color of old blood, with mandibles that could probably bite through steel and definitely bite through flesh. He ruled Cell Block 9 through a combination of violence, intimidation, and the fact that he'd killed the previous ruler in front of everyone during lunch. Dan had been careful to avoid Grelmoth's attention. Unfortunately, being human made you stand out, and standing out eventually attracted exactly the kind of attention you didn't want. Grelmoth stood up from his table. His entourage, 3 smaller insectoid creatures who served as his enforcers, stood with him. The cafeteria grew quieter, that special kind of quiet that meant someone was about to have a very bad day and everyone wanted to watch. Human, Grelmoth's voice was like gravel being processed through a meat grinder. He spoke Galactic Common with an accent that suggested he'd learned it specifically for the purpose of threatening people. "You sit at my table." Dan looked down at his table, then up at Grelmoth. "This table? I'm pretty sure this is just a regular table. There's no name on it or anything." "All tables are my tables," Grelmoth clarified, moving closer. His footsteps made the floor vibrate slightly. "You breathe my air. You occupy my space. You exist in my prison." "Technically, it's Warden Polnexra's prison," Dan pointed out, taking another spoonful of sludge. "You're just renting, same as me." The entourage hissed in unison, a sound that made Dan's teeth ache. Grelmoth leaned down, bringing his face close to Dan's. His breath smelled like something had died, been resurrected, then died again. "You do not show respect. In my culture, disrespect is answered with death." "That seems excessive," Dan said mildly. "Have you considered anger management classes? I hear they do wonders." What happened next happened fast. Grelmoth's arm, the one that ended in a blade-like appendage instead of a hand, came up and then came down, right through Dan's chest. The chitinous blade punched through sternum, lung, and out the back of the chair with a sound like a wet crunch mixed with tearing metal. The cafeteria went absolutely silent. Dan looked down at the blade protruding from his chest. Blood was spreading across his gray jumpsuit, warm and wet and very, very red. He could feel his heart struggling around the foreign object, could feel his lung collapsing, could feel his body beginning the shutdown sequence that meant death was about 10 seconds away. He looked up at Grelmoth. "Well," Dan said, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth, "this is awkward." Then he grabbed the blade with both hands and pulled himself forward, off the chair, sliding along the length of the blade until he was standing face to face with the shocked insectoid. Grelmoth's eyes, all 8 of them, widened in something that might have been fear. Dan pulled himself completely off the blade, staggering backward, one hand pressed to the massive hole in his chest. Blood poured between his fingers, pooling on the floor, far too much blood for anyone to survive losing. Guards were shouting, running toward them, boots thundering on metal. Dan coughed, spattering blood across the floor. Then he straightened up, removing his hand from the wound, and the wound began to close. It wasn't fast, not like in the entertainment vids where healing happened in seconds with dramatic light effects. It was organic, visceral, disturbing to watch. Tissue knitting itself back together, blood vessels reconnecting, skin crawling across the gap like it was being pulled by invisible threads. The sound it made was worse than the sight, a wet, organic squelching that made several prisoners turn away. 30 seconds later, Dan's chest was whole. The jumpsuit was still torn and soaked with blood, but underneath there was nothing but unmarked skin and a faint pink scar that was already fading. Dan wiped blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. "So, here's the thing about disrespect in my culture," he said conversationally. "We generally prefer it to being stabbed. Call me old-fashioned." Grelmoth took a step backward, his blade arm trembling. The guards arrived, weapons drawn, shouting orders that no one was listening to. Everyone was staring at Dan, at the blood on the floor, at the torn jumpsuit, at the complete absence of a fatal wound that had definitely, absolutely, without question, been there moments ago. "Everyone back to your cells," the lead guard bellowed. "Now! Lockdown protocol!" Prisoners scattered, but slowly, reluctantly, still watching Dan like he was something from a nightmare that had wandered into their reality. 2 guards grabbed Dan by the arms. He didn't resist. Just let them haul him away, leaving bloody footprints across the cafeteria floor. As they dragged him toward solitary confinement, Dan caught Grelmoth's eye one last time. The crime lord looked terrified. Good, Dan thought. Fear was useful. Fear meant people left you alone. And he had work to do. Solitary confinement was a small metal box with a cot, a toilet, and absolutely nothing else. No windows, no entertainment, no human contact, which was ironic given the name of the species. Just Dan, his thoughts, and the faint hum of the ship's life support systems vibrating through the walls. He'd been there for 2 days when Dr. Feltrine arrived. She was a Kilshara, a species known for their medical expertise and their unsettling number of eyes. 12 of them, arranged in a circular pattern around her elongated head, giving her 360-degree vision. Her skin was a pale lavender, smooth and slightly luminescent in the dim light. She wore the standard medical uniform of the prison staff, and she carried a medical scanner that looked far more sophisticated than the intake equipment. "Hello, Dan," she said, her voice melodic, almost soothing. The Kilshara were also known for excellent bedside manner, which made them popular as doctors, and deeply disturbing as interrogators. "I am Dr. Feltrine. I need to examine you." "Do I have a choice?" Dan asked from where he sat on the cot. "No," she said pleasantly, "but I thought it polite to pretend you did. I appreciate the gesture." She moved closer, activating the scanner. It hummed to life, projecting a holographic display of biological data that Dan couldn't fully interpret, but recognized as probably concerning. The incident in the cafeteria was witnessed by 83 prisoners and 11 guards. Video surveillance confirms what they reported. You were impaled through the chest cavity. Fatal damage to major organs and circulatory systems. And yet, you survived. "I'm a fast healer," Dan said. "No species heals that fast." Dr. Feltrine's eyes rotated independently, some watching Dan, others watching the scanner readout. "I have practiced medicine for 43 cycles. I have treated over 900 species. I have never seen anything like this. First time for everything." "I need to take samples," she said, producing a small device that looked like a combination of a needle and a very aggressive stapler. "Tissue, blood, cellular material. This will hurt." "Most things do." She pressed the device against his arm. There was a sharp crack, a spike of pain, and then she pulled back with a small vial of tissue and blood. Dan watched as the puncture wound in his arm sealed itself within seconds, skin knitting closed like it had never been damaged. Dr. Feltrine's eyes all focused on the wound site simultaneously, which was deeply unsettling. "Remarkable. The cellular regeneration is instantaneous. Your body treats injury as a temporary inconvenience." "Pretty much sums up my life," Dan muttered. She spent the next hour running tests, drew more blood, took more tissue samples, scanned him with devices that made his teeth buzz and his vision blur. Through it all, Dan cooperated, answering her questions with vague half-truths and deflections that had become second nature over the years. "Your genetic structure is human," she said finally, studying the holographic display with what looked like frustration. "Standard DNA helix. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that should produce this level of regenerative capability. And yet, the evidence is undeniable." "Maybe I'm just special," Dan offered. "Or maybe you are lying about what you are." Several of her eyes fixed on him with laser focus. "Perhaps you are not human at all. Perhaps you are something else wearing a human appearance." "That's a bit philosophical for a medical exam." Dr. Feltrine deactivated the scanner and stood still for a long moment, all 12 eyes regarding him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I am going to report to Warden Polnexra that the scanner was correct. You are an anomaly, a biological impossibility, and that makes you dangerous." "I'm really not," Dan said. "I'm just trying to serve my time quietly." "Nothing about you is quiet." She moved toward the door, then paused. "What are you, really?" Dan met her gaze, or at least several of her gazes. "I'm a father looking for his daughter. Everything else is just details." She left without another word, and Dan was alone again with the hum of the ship and the weight of his own thoughts. 3 more days passed. Dan was returned to his cell in Block 9, where he was greeted with a combination of fear and fascination. Prisoners gave him a wide berth. Grelmoth and his entourage had transferred to a different cell block entirely, which Dan considered a victory. Then Relac arrived. He came without fanfare, without guards, just walked into Dan's cell like he owned it. He was Dithen, a species Dan had only encountered once before, and that encounter had not gone well. The Dithen were tall, almost skeletal in appearance, with elongated limbs and faces that were more angles than curves. Their skin was a deep indigo, and their eyes glowed with a faint bioluminescence that made them look perpetually surprised. They were also telepathic empaths, which meant Relax could feel every emotion Dan was experiencing and probably several he wasn't aware of yet. Dan, Relax said, his voice soft but carrying an weight that made the air feel heavier. I am Interrogator Relax. Grath High Command has sent me to determine the truth of your nature. Can't wait, Dan said from his cot. Should I get comfortable, or is this going to be quick? That depends entirely on you. Relax gestured, and 2 guards entered carrying equipment. Restraints, medical devices, things that hummed with energy that made Dan's skin crawl. They set up the equipment efficiently, then left without meeting Dan's eyes. Here is what will happen, Relax said calmly. I will subject you to various forms of injury and stress. Atmospheric pressure changes, toxic exposure, energy weapons. I will document your body's response. If you cooperate and answer my questions truthfully, this will be completed quickly. And if I don't cooperate, then it will take longer, but it will be completed regardless. Relax's glowing eyes dimmed slightly. I take no pleasure in this. I am simply following orders. Everyone's just following orders, Dan said, right up until they're not. The first test was atmospheric pressure. Relax sealed the cell and began reducing the oxygen content while increasing the pressure. Dan's ears popped. His lungs struggled. He felt blood vessels in his eyes burst, felt his organs beginning to compress under the force. He passed out. When he woke up, the pressure was normal again, and his body had repaired itself. Relax was taking notes on a datapad. How long was I unconscious? Dan asked, his voice hoarse. 18 minutes. You died at minute 6. Your heart stopped. Your brain ceased function. Then, at minute 9, your body restarted itself. Autonomic systems reactivated. Cellular repair began. By minute 15, you were functionally alive again. Great, Dan coughed. Love a good nap. The tests continued. Toxins that should have shut down his nervous system. Energy weapons that burned through flesh and bone. Each time, Dan died. Each time, he came back. Each time, Relax took notes with the detached professionalism of a scientist documenting an interesting specimen. By the 4th day, Dan's sense of humor was getting darker, more manic, fueled by exhaustion and the surreal horror of dying repeatedly while someone watched and wrote things down. You know, Dan said while Relax was preparing another test, this one involving electrical current, you guys really need better hobbies. Have you considered stamp collecting? Model ships? Literally anything that doesn't involve killing someone over and over? Your attempts at humor are a coping mechanism, Relax observed. I can feel your fear, your pain, your exhaustion. The jokes are armor. And here, I thought they were just jokes. Relax paused, setting down the electrical device. I am going to try something different. I am going to ask you questions, and I would like you to answer them honestly. If you do, I will suspend the physical tests. Why the sudden change of heart? Because torture is inefficient, and you are clearly not going to break under physical duress. Relax sat down on the floor, cross-legged, his long limbs folding in ways that looked anatomically improbable. So, let us talk. Dan sat up on the cot, every muscle aching from injuries that were already healed, but left phantom pains in their wake. What do you want to know? Everything. Start with the truth. What are you? And maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the fact that Relax's empathic abilities meant lying was pointless anyway. But Dan found himself talking. He told Relac about Genesis Point, the research station orbiting a dead star 20 cycles ago. 6 scientists studying exotic matter, trying to understand the quantum mechanics of stellar collapse. The accident that flooded the lab with impossible radiation, particles that existed in states that violated every known law of physics. 5 scientists died instantly, their bodies simply ceasing to exist at the molecular level. Dan survived. More than survived. The radiation rewrote him at the cellular level, locked his body into a quantum state between life and death. His cells existed in constant flux, simultaneously alive and dead, collapsing into life whenever death tried to claim him. "I can't die," Dan said quietly. "My body won't let me. I've tried. Believe me, I've tried. But whatever those particles did to me, they made death impossible. My cells reject it. They rebuild, restart, repair, no matter the damage." "And this cannot be replicated?" Relac asked. "The station was destroyed. The star collapsed completely. The exotic matter doesn't exist anymore. I'm the only one left, the only evidence it ever happened." "So you are unique, truly unkillable." "Lucky me." Relac was quiet for a long time, his glowing eyes studying Dan with an intensity that felt like it was peeling back layers. "You allowed yourself to be captured. Why?" Dan met his gaze. "Because my daughter was on a colony ship that vanished in this sector 8 months ago. And I've heard rumors that Garath military operations were involved. I need access to your records. I need to know where she is." "And you thought infiltrating a maximum security prison was the best approach?" "I thought it was the only approach." Relac stood, his expression unreadable. "You are either very brave or very foolish." "Why not both?" The interrogator moved toward the door, then stopped. "The Dethen value family bonds above all else. It is the foundation of our culture. What you are doing, this impossible quest, I understand it. Does that mean you'll help me?" Relac didn't answer. He simply left, and Dan was alone again, wondering if he'd just made everything better or infinitely worse. 4 hours later, Relac returned. He came alone, without guards, and he carried a small data chip in his elongated fingers. His bioluminescent eyes were dimmer than usual, suggesting either fatigue or deep thought. And when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Dan recognized immediately. The weight of a decision that couldn't be undone. "I have accessed the classified database," Relac said without preamble. "The prison security systems are extensive, but I have clearance from High Command that grants me access to materials necessary for interrogation purposes. I stretched the definition of necessary." Dan sat up straighter, every nerve suddenly alert. "And?" "The colony ship you mentioned, the Meridian Dawn, was intercepted by Garath military forces 9 months ago. Official records indicate it was destroyed for violating territorial boundaries." Relac paused, and his eyes flickered with something that might have been sympathy. "The official records are lies." Dan's hands clenched into fists, the only outward sign of the hope and rage warring inside him. "Where are they?" The ship was boarded. Crew and passengers were processed as enemy combatants and sent to a labor facility on Gorleth 6, a moon in the Outer Territories. 342 individuals. The records list them by species and age range. Relac held up the data chip. "I found a manifest. There is a human female, age 19, designation GLS 0847. "Gia," Dan breathed. "Presumably. The records are 8 months old. I cannot confirm current status, but there is no death notation. In Garath record-keeping, the absence of a death notation typically indicates the individual is still alive and functioning." "Functioning," Dan repeated, the word tasting like acid. They have my daughter on a labor moon, and they call it functioning. The Garath Empire does not recognize the personhood of non-citizens. To them, your daughter is a resource allocation. Relak's voice remained neutral, but Dan could sense the distaste underneath. The Dethen might work for the Grath, but they clearly didn't share all their employers' values. I am telling you this because I believe what you said about being a father searching for your daughter. My people would do the same. So what now? Dan asked. You report back to High Command that you've confirmed I'm unkillable, and they either keep me here forever or dissect me to figure out how it works. That was my original intention, Relak admitted, but I find myself reconsidering. You are an anomaly, but you are not a threat to galactic stability. You are simply a father who made an impossible choice and paid an impossible price. The Dethen have a saying, the bonds of family transcend the laws of empire. That's a good saying. It has caused my people considerable political difficulty over the centuries. Relak moved closer, lowering his voice even though they were alone. I can help you escape. The prison security has vulnerabilities. During the scheduled maintenance window in 3 hours, certain systems will experience temporary failures. If someone were to reach the hangar bay during that window, they might find a small transport vessel insufficiently guarded. Dan stared at him. Why would you do this? If they find out, you'll be executed. Perhaps. Or perhaps I will claim you overpowered me, used your unkillable nature to survive my interrogation techniques, and escaped during the chaos. I am, after all, not a combat specialist. Simply an interrogator. Relak's eyes brightened slightly, which might have been the Dethen equivalent of a smile. The beauty of working with someone who cannot die is that the story becomes believable. You've thought this through. I have had little else to do while watching you die repeatedly. It gave me time to consider the ethics of my position. He held out the data chip. This contains the coordinates for Gorlith 6 and the location of the labor facility. It also contains my personal credentials, which should allow you limited access to Grath systems. They will be deactivated within 1 day of your escape, so use them wisely. Dan took the chip, closing his fingers around it like it was the most precious thing in the galaxy. Which, at this moment, it was. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. Getting to the hangar will be dangerous. And even if you escape, reaching Gorlith 6 will be more dangerous still. The facility is heavily guarded. Attempting a rescue will likely result in your death. I've died before, Dan said. I'll get better. Yes, Relak said quietly. I suppose you will. The maintenance window began at 2200 hours, announced by a ship-wide alert that most prisoners ignored. Maintenance happened regularly, usually without incident, just the normal operations of keeping a massive orbital prison functional. Tonight would not be normal. Dan moved through his cell door the moment the energy barrier flickered and died. The backup systems would kick in within minutes, but those minutes were all he needed. He'd memorized the route to the hangar during his time here, piecing together information from overheard conversations and careful observation. The corridors were dimmer than usual, emergency lighting casting everything in a red glow that made the metal walls look like the inside of something biological. Dan moved quickly, but carefully, listening for guards, for other prisoners, for any sign that his window was closing. He made it to level 2 before the first alarm sounded. Someone had noticed the security failures weren't limited to his cell. Someone had started asking questions, and now the entire prison was waking up to the fact that something was very, very wrong. Dan broke into a run. Behind him, he could hear guards mobilizing, boots thundering on metal, voices shouting orders in multiple languages. Ahead, the corridor split. One path leading toward the administrative section, the other toward the hangar bay. He went left. Two guards rounded the corner ahead of him, weapons raised. They shouted for him to stop, to get on the ground, to surrender immediately. Dan kept running. The plasma bolts hit him in the chest and shoulder, burning through flesh and bone with superheated energy that turned his insides to steam. The pain was extraordinary, a white-hot agony that sent him stumbling, falling, sliding across the metal floor in a spreading pool of his own blood. He was dead before he hit the ground. 30 seconds later, his heart restarted. The guards were standing over him, checking for a pulse they wouldn't find because his cardiovascular system was still rebuilding itself. One of them was speaking into a communicator, reporting the situation. Dan's eyes opened. He grabbed the nearest guard's ankle and pulled hard. The guard went down with a startled yelp, his weapon clattering across the floor. Dan rolled, his body still regenerating, organs still knitting themselves back together, and grabbed the plasma rifle. The second guard fired, hitting Dan in the head. Everything went dark. When Dan woke up again, both guards were unconscious, stunned by their own weapons, and he was covered in blood, but functionally intact. His head throbbed with phantom pain from an injury that no longer existed, and he was getting really tired of dying tonight. He ran. The hangar bay was massive, easily the size of a city block, filled with transport ships, maintenance vehicles, and cargo haulers. Most were locked down, security protocols engaged, but near the far wall, exactly where Relac had indicated, sat a small transport vessel with its boarding ramp down and its systems humming on standby. Dan sprinted toward it, ignoring the shouts behind him, ignoring the plasma fire that scorched the air around him. One bolt caught him in the leg, shattering his femur and sending him sprawling. He crawled the last 20 meters, dragging his useless leg behind him, feeling the bone beginning to knit back together even as he moved. He reached the ramp, hauled himself up, slammed the door control. The ramp closed just as a massive figure appeared at the hangar entrance. Warden Polnexra, all four arms spread wide, his scales catching the emergency lighting, his 6 eyes burning with rage. "Human!" his voice boomed across the hangar, amplified by the acoustics. "You cannot escape. Surrender now, and your death will be quick." Dan limped to the pilot's seat, his leg almost fully healed now, and activated the ship's systems. The controls were Grath design, but ships were ships, and he'd been flying since before most of these guards were born. "Sorry, Warden," Dan muttered, strapping himself in. "I've got a previous engagement." The transport's engines roared to life. Polnexra was running toward the ship now, faster than something that size should be able to move. He reached the vessel just as it lifted off, one massive hand slamming against the hull hard enough to dent the metal. Then the ship was rising, spinning, orienting toward the hangar's atmospheric shield. Dan pushed the throttle forward, and the transport shot through the shimmering barrier into open space. Behind him, the obsidian maw erupted with activity. Alarms blaring, defense systems activating, pursuit ships launching. But Dan had a head start, and more importantly, he had coordinates. He punched in the jump calculations for Gorleth 6, his hands moving with practiced efficiency across the controls. The ship's faster-than-light drive spun up, space beginning to bend and twist around the vessel. A message appeared on the communications panel. Audio only. Polnexra's voice, cold and controlled now, the rage buried under professional fury. This is not over, human. I will find you. I will drag you back to the obsidian maw, and I will spend the rest of eternity making you regret this escape. You are unkillable. That means I have forever to make you suffer. Dan reached for the communications control, then paused. He activated the microphone. Warden Polnexra, I appreciate the threat. Really, top-notch intimidation. But here's the thing. Dan's voice was steady, calm, carrying the weight of someone who had died more times than he could count and stopped being afraid somewhere around the 20th resurrection. I'm going to find my daughter, and if anyone, Garath military or otherwise, gets in my way, they're going to learn exactly what unkillable means. It doesn't mean I can't be hurt. It means I don't stay down. Ever. You can kill me 1,000 times, and I'll get back up 1,001. He cut the transmission. The faster-than-light drive engaged, and space folded, and the transport vanished into the impossible geometry of interstellar travel. Dan sat back in the pilot's seat, exhausted, aching with injuries that were already healed, but left their mark on his nervous system anyway. He pulled out the data chip Relak had given him and slotted it into the ship's computer. A holographic display materialized, showing the location of Gorleth 6, the layout of the labor facility, and a single line of text that made his breath catch. Prisoner GLS 0847. Status: active. Location: Processing Center 12. Gia was alive. Dan stared at the display, at the moon that was still 3 days away, even at faster-than-light speeds. At the facility where his daughter had spent 8 months as a prisoner of an empire that didn't consider her a person. I'm coming, Gia, he whispered to the empty ship, to the void outside, to whatever quantum state kept him tethered. To life. I'm coming, and nothing in this galaxy is going to stop me. The ship raced through folded space, carrying an unkillable man toward an impossible rescue. And somewhere in the universe, reality itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen when a father who couldn't die met an empire that didn't believe in mercy. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning.